Procurement League. So I'm going to quickly tell all of you how I know Sandeep. When I was in Hong Kong, I was teaching a wild, crazy bunch of high schoolers at a school, and I'd got a job at another big school in Hong Kong, which would pay me 3 times the money of what I was getting paid there. And then I was just like, my grandmom passed away. I came to India and I was just like, I don't know, like, what am I doing living in all these countries, teaching all these kids who don't even belong to these countries? Maybe I should just move back to India. So I wrote to Sandeep on LinkedIn. I wrote to him everywhere. And I'm like, hey, I'm a high school advisor and a teacher for neurodiverse classrooms. But I want to move to India and I want to come work with Teach for India. So I kind of like got after them, and I went through multiple rounds of interviews, and I don't know if they'd ever hired a teacher into a leadership position like that. Or Teach for India just takes big leaps all the time and big risks. So yeah, I joined from Hong Kong to Teach for India, and I got to work for 3.5 years under the best, most wisest people that I've ever known. It changed me internally as a human being. Just the kind of work that they do, the vision that they have, just this integrity and seriousness in our world today that's kind of missing, is what kind of Teach for India brings. Just a sense of values and truth telling that they do themselves is it's fabulous. I don't know how they do it. So that's why this is just so big for me to have Sandeep be with us. Thank you, Sandeep. I'm going to let you introduce yourself. This is my story of you, but I'm going to let you tell your story of you.
Thank you for that, Devangana. It's good to be talking to you, and thank you for taking the time so early as well, on a holiday too, and so appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I was born and raised in the U.S. My parents immigrated to the U.S. actually in 1969, and I grew up in a small town in Jackson, Mississippi, and my roots really go back there. And I grew up thinking that I would actually become a doctor, and so I was convinced that I was going to go into medicine. And my brother became a doctor, my sister became a doctor, and so I had this like long lineage of like medicine with my siblings, and my parents were just convinced that it was the ticket to greater opportunity, right? And so to give you evidence of what that meant, like when I was a teenager, I was shadowing surgeries, learning about medical research. When I was a small child, I think about the age of 5, I had visited a morgue for the first time. When I was like 6, I could tell you all the bones of the human face. And so when I was about 20 years old, I was in my last year of college, and I had a bit of an epiphany. And that epiphany was that I was basically doing this for all of the wrong reasons. I was going into medicine for all of the wrong reasons. And there's nothing wrong with the profession. I think it's a highly noble profession. God knows we need more doctors. But the reasons that I was going into it didn't feel pure. They didn't feel right. And I took a hard, long look in the mirror, and I said, like, what's the kind of impact that I really want to create? And who's the person that I want to become? And when I look back in the mirror later on, like, who's the person I want to be? And I think like my answers to that, like, I don't know if they were fully formed, but I felt compelled to start by teaching. And so I actually joined Teach for America. I taught for 2 years in a very, very struggling school, in the middle of Washington, D.C. And this school was like, I mean, we had fights breaking out pretty much daily. Like, our kids came from really tough backgrounds, dealt with all sorts of violence in their neighborhoods. It was in what was like the most impoverished part of DC. And like those 2 years were transformative beyond belief. Like my first couple of months, to be honest with you, like a large percentage of my time went in like breaking up fights, went in like trying to figure out how to build relationships with kids. Yeah. But what happened, I think, over time was a couple of things. Like one, I think I realized that like at the end of the day, you peel away all of the jadedness, you peel away like all of the facades, and my kids were kids, right? And two, as I think through that, I realized that my kids just had enormous potential. And so those 2 years like taught me a couple of big things. Like one is they taught me that like this work is just so needed, right? Like education has the potential to be a game changer for kids, but for so many it doesn't. Um, and then two, it taught me that like it's just solvable. And it taught me that it's solvable, but it taught me that like you need leadership and you need people, and people are everything. And so after those 2 years, I think I just realized that this is what I was going to be doing probably for a lifetime. And I kind of on a whim jumped on a flight, flew to India. I thought I would be coming to India for a year. At that point, Teach for India, the organization that I've been with for the past 14 years, it was an idea, it was a blueprint. And I came to basically try to figure out how to get it off the ground. And said I would come here for a year max to help launch it, like help get it off the ground. And basically I ended up staying for 14. And basically these last 14 years that I've been in India and I Teach for India have, I probably played 1,000 different roles, but most recently, like served as our chief of city operations, which basically means I've straddled and spanned a lot of our operations across our regions, but also a lot to do with our fellowship design, our 2 years and all of that. Let me pause there.
Amazing. So I think like Sandeep in my beginnings was similar, where my family was like, you should become a doctor, you should become, be traveling across the world and doing these things. And I met a child with Down syndrome and autism, and I'm like, I don't know, I can't think of anything else to do but that. So I think life kind of keeps getting you back to where you started off from and where you belong. So yeah, I think that's so true, and that's beautiful. Okay, so Sandeep, let's start talking a little bit about the Circle India. Like just I'd love for you to first of all explain to us what is it?
Yeah. So we're an organization that is focused on saying, how do you reinvent what school can become? And we're really rooted in these 4 big beliefs, right? And I'll start by telling you what those beliefs are, because they underlie pretty much everything that we do, right? So instead of telling you what it is, I'm going to try to start by telling you like why we do what we do. And one of those beliefs is probably the belief that's kept me in India for a little under 15 years. And that is that like education has the potential to be a game changer for kids from low income backgrounds. And the data is just incredibly compelling. Right? Like if you are in the 10th grade and you graduate from the 10th grade in India, you will earn 3 times as much. If you graduate from the 12th grade, you'll actually earn 6 times as much. If you graduate from college in India, you will earn 12 times as much. Like the data is incredibly compelling. And yet at the same time, like 70% of kids are still dropping out before they get to 10th, right? And when you double click on that some more, like you realize that we have 500 million kids under the age of 25 in this country. We have 370 million under the age of 18, right? Like those numbers are just staggering. And I think a large part of what's kept me here and what's one of our biggest underlying beliefs at the Circle is just that we are at this moment in history. Like we are at this moment in time, and you could see how this could go either way. Like we could either tap into the potential of those 370 million, or like we could actually continue on the path that we do. And I think that the path that we choose, and I use the word choose deliberately, the path that we choose from here on out will have enormous implications for the future of the country, but potentially for the future of the world. And so that's belief number 1, right? And the second big belief that we operate with is this belief that like schools are kind of going obsolete. And when I say that, I mean schools across India and across the world, like they are preparing kids for a world and for a country that is stuck in the past. Like they're preparing kids for 1970s India. And to highlight what I mean there, Gallup does this survey every single year, right? And actually several organizations do this survey where they ask employers, like, what are the top 3 skills that are most relevant for graduates to be walking out of? And guess what they say? Guess what they said in 1970, Devangana? What do you think employers said? 1970, top 3 skills.
Leadership.
Leadership.
Like to be able to like be agile in the workforce.
Yeah.
Um,
So in 1970, they said reading, writing, and arithmetic. And those were the top three skills that actually employers wanted graduates to have in 1970. Those are the top three, right? Reading, writing, and arithmetic. Fast forward 50 years to 2020, and what do you think they said?
Probably the same. I don't know.
Yeah, they said complex problem solving, they said creativity, and they said cognitive empathy. And so think about how much like of a massive shift the workforce has gone through and the world has gone through for the top three skills 50 years ago to be reading, writing, and arithmetic, and 50 years later to be complex problem solving, cognitive empathy, and creativity.
Sandeep,
And yet,
Sandeep, sometimes when I keep like comparing what was said to what is said, and do you sometimes think that when they thought about reading and writing and all of that, they actually maybe possibly meant because reading probably was a very complex task at that time. Writing was a complex task, and so was arithmetic. Um,
totally. And I think it was just what was needed, right? Like, I think those were the predominant skills actually needed for the workforce at the time. Um, but like workforces have gone under immense transformation. The world has gone under immense transformation. But the truth is that like our schools really haven't, right? Like our schools are pretty much still catering to kids for a 1970s world. And the vast majority of skills are pretty much spending majority of their time focusing on reading, writing, and arithmetic. And so the second thing that we're like operating with is that like schools are on the verge of going obsolete. And if we don't do something to figure out how to make two things happen, one, how to modernize them and get them to prepare kids for the future, and two, how to actually get them to serve all kids, then they're just in a lot of danger. And so that's the second big belief. And the third big belief that we operate with is like this belief that like kids in India are actually in school for 4.5 hours a day, right? It's one of the lowest in the world. And they're in school on average for 165 days a year. Now, I'm not talking about like your upper like 20%. I'm talking about your like bottom 75 to 80%. 4.5 hours, 165 days a year are the averages. When you do the math on that, and you actually ask yourself, like, what percentage of kids' waking hours, forget the time that they're asleep, assume that they're asleep for 8 hours a day, kids are only spending 11% of their waking hours in a given year inside of a school building. It's insane, right? Like 89% of kids' time are actually spent outside of school. And yet, like all of us, we continue to basically say like, learning should only happen within that 11%. And we all keep on trying to like go down this. How do you fit more learning into the 11%? How do you fit more learning into the 4.5 hours? And what we at the Circle are questioning is like, what if you could design around all 100%? And when I tell that to most people, they're like, oh my God, like, why would you want to bore kids with that? Like, why would you want to like think about like moving learning into all that time? Like kids should have balance and kids should have breaks. And I'm a believer in that, don't get me wrong. But underlying what people are saying is this belief that like schools just taste a lot like cough syrup. Like it's this belief that like schools, you just have to get it done. Like you drink it and eventually it will make you better in the future. And what we at the Circle are questioning is like, if school weren't seen as something that is boring, that is monotonous, that you just get it done with, it gives you greater opportunity, like would we be more willing to design around all 100%? If we could design around all 100%, like what would that do for the future of kids? And so that's the third big belief. And the fourth and the final one is we are witnessing what feels like a massive degradation in society. Like we are witnessing a breakdown in human relationships, and pick an issue and like that there's evidence of that, right? Pick caste, pick like religion, pick race if you're outside of India and the US, pick like gender across the world, right? And if you were to break that down to the most reductivist part possible, like at the heart of it is we have breakdowns in how people treat one another. Like we have fundamental breakdowns in what is the social contract. if you would have asked me about 10 years ago what I believe the purpose of education was, I would have told you opportunity, opportunity, opportunity. Like it needs to give kids greater opportunity. And I still very firmly believe that. But I think I now believe that it's just not enough. Like schools have to be playing a role in equipping kids to create a better world. And if they don't do that, then it's almost like, what are we doing? We're just perpetuating a world that is broken. And so that's our fourth belief, is that like, we believe that schools have to play a role in equipping kids to be change makers. So I tell you those four, Devangana, I mean, for like, because they underlie everything that we do, right? Schools have the potential to be able to equip kids with greater opportunity, but they are not. Schools are currently going pretty much obsolete. They're serving kids for 1970s India. The third is that like, why aren't we designing around all 100%? And the fourth is that like our schools need to play a role in equipping kids to be change makers. Let me pause there and I can quickly tell you what we do, but let me pause there because I think
So I have
that's a
two
big part of what
follow-up
drives.
questions.
Yeah, please.
Like Sandeep, I kind of used to at many points in my life, like I paused and I've just wanted to see classrooms, see school systems, and see other systems work in utopia. In Hong Kong, it wasn't in my country, but I'd be an activist in Jakarta and Indonesia and New York, I'd march for autism, but then go and like talk to the mayor and say, why are we doing this? So I've done a lot of this stuff, fighting for what I thought was right. But here are my two questions, Sandeep. One is, every individual, especially in our most oppressed, traumatized schools and backgrounds, come from their own stories. When they actually start to read and write, their stories become more and more complex and real in their own hands, which means that sometimes for school systems to be able to facilitate them making the world a better place becomes really hard. So I work with a lot of kids today who can read everything, but the moment I pause them to make them comprehend and understand and say, what are you going to do with it? I've been attacked and bitten and screamed at and slapped and yelled by kids because they're just like, you come from a space of protection and care and love. We don't. If you want us to kind of live our history through reading and writing and complex problem solving, we're livid and we're angry. We don't want to make the world a better place. How And that's the truth that we live with every day. And I think that's where a lot of school systems and teachers either go one way, which is they don't care about comprehension and you know like truly complex problem solving and reading and writing. What they do is they go the other way, which is just like, could you pass the test? Great, you've got a great result, go on in the workforce. But the ones that actually do help kids externalize their internal backgrounds through reading and writing and what they want to do in life, it's hard to kind of balance the two. How do you make the world a better place while pulling these people out of the 70% of darkness that they've been in? So I'd love to hear more about that.
I think I used to believe that it was linear. And I don't think that I believe it's linear anymore is the short answer, right? And when I say that, like, I mean, I used to believe that like you first give kids and you equip kids with fundamental skills. And then once they have those fundamental skills, then you basically help them become change makers. I think I've seen enough classrooms, enough schools, and enough kids that are showing me that that linearity doesn't exist, right? Like it is possible to leapfrog. And that like, actually, if you give kids the opportunities to be able to impact others at very young ages, like kids will actually learn much faster. That there is like the possibility of integration. There is the possibility of me learning the fundamentals through actually serving others. And I think that there are examples across the world that I think are doing this, and here in India that are doing this. But I think that I just don't believe it's linear anymore. Like that's the short answer. And I think that if kids are given the opportunity to be able to to serve and to actually like change things around them, more often than not, I'm not saying in all cases, but more often than not, I think I find kids thriving in that. I find in my experience that brokenness, and I believe that we're all broken to some degree, but brokenness like doesn't impede people's ability to be able to impact others. In fact, in more cases than not, I think I've found that it actually has the potential to fuel it. And I don't think that that's like the case in all, but yeah, let me pause here again.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I feel like till the time we don't fill and to some extent seal our brokenness, I worry will we really be able to do for the world what we want to do? And are our school systems equipping us? I keep asking myself as I work with kids, are our school systems equipping us, our kids, to first be able to fully store, completely make your own brokenness compact, whoever you are, wherever you come from, before we get out in the world? And I think like that's where my utopia begins and ends, because I just feel like that's how history has been made. None of like it's the hardest task to accomplish if we want to.
Yeah.
Sandeep, so just like taking off from here, and I think like you can kind of build on that while you talk about. So, what kind of entrepreneurship will the Circle India foster, keeping in mind like everything that you just spoke about? Yeah.
Yeah. So we're doing three big things at the circle. I'll start with the first two, and I think that'll answer the question, right? Like, one is what we're doing is we're actually saying, can we build networks of schools and after school centers that are trying to reinvent what school could be, right? And the reason that we're focusing on after school centers is because of the 89%, right? And we're leaning into the theory of how do you create networks and not chains, right? And when I say networks and not chains, I mean like a difference would be like a McDonald's is a chain, right? And they do a very good job of being a chain. That basically means they have a model, they replicate that model relentlessly, and you can get consistency across. What we're trying to lean into is a network theory. And underlying that is like, how do you give people enormous amounts of autonomy and agency and empower them and believe that actually if you can surround people in schools with a learning infrastructure, like it will unleash innovation and you will move faster. And so what we're trying to say is, can we build networks of independently operated schools and after school centers that are connected by a common learning infrastructure and a common set of principles? And how we're doing that is we're trying to say, can we build an incubation for entrepreneurs who want to reinvent what school could be? And so this November, we're actually launching our first cohort where we are going on a journey with a small group of entrepreneurs down a 2-year journey where we will actually work hand in hand with those entrepreneurs to help them design a more innovative school, to help them launch a more innovative school, and to help them figure out how to run a more innovative school. And this 2-year journey will mean that these entrepreneurs will work with coaches, they'll work with school leader coaches, they'll work with executive coaches. They'll actually visit high-performing schools across the country as well as across the world. They'll serve in an apprenticeship with a high-performing school. They'll work through a design thinking process where they will actually start by spending time with communities and families and saying, like, what is it that I'm learning communities and families actually need? What is it that I'm learning kids are saying that they want and need from the education system? And then they will actually design around that. And through that process, like especially through year one, they will go through this cyclical process of where am I gleaning inspiration from? What am I learning from kids and families? And how do I practice designing around that? After year one, they'll actually move that into pilot mode. And they'll start to pilot that with groups of kids. And through that, they'll work with coaches who are actually helping them say, like, is this design making its way into implementation? Yes or no? And at the end of year two, they will launch. Right? And once they launch, these entrepreneurs will be running these independent schools and after school programs across the country. And they essentially subscribe and get immersed in this lifetime of support. And what that means is that they'll be connected by by a learning network. That means they'll be connected to coaches, they'll be connected to a professional development ecosystem as they continue to build that school and after school program. So our goal is to basically go on this journey with a group of entrepreneurs this November, and then to do that each year. And through that, to start to build a network of schools and after school centers that are functioning across the country. And that's the first thing that we're starting to do. And the second thing that we're doing is what we call labs. And with labs, what we're really aiming to do is to say, like, can we reach as many educators, as many business leaders as we possibly can? Can we start to change the conversation around what school is and around what school could be? And so with labs, we're launching workshops across the country. We're doing guest lecture series. We're actually, providing a bit of innovation funding for teachers to be able to innovate within their classrooms. We're actually trying to get into design resources. We're just trying to launch small tools and opportunities for people to get their feet wet. To say, if you're interested in actually rethinking and redesigning this thing we call school, like, here's an opportunity to start to get your feet wet. So let me pause there. Let me see if that answers a little bit of what you were.
It does. So Sandeep, I'm curious, tell me, how much of what kind of innovation the school wants to do are you guys going to like direct and hold, and how much are you going to let it just be the entrepreneur deciding and defining how they want to create the school?
Excellent question. About 70% of it, if not 80% of it, will be fully driven by the entrepreneur. What we are trying to do and what we are trying to hold is a common set of principles, right? And I'll tell you what some of those principles are. They are more values-based principles, but they are important principles that we believe hold us together. One of those is the commitment to equity. And so what that means is every entrepreneur that's working with us has to ensure that at least 50% of their kids come from underserved backgrounds, because we are committed to basically to equity, and we are committed to underserved communities. And the second big commitment that we're leaning into is a commitment to results. And so what we're actually saying is that every entrepreneur needs to be deeply entrenched in being committed to measuring results. Now, that does not mean that we're going to come in and say, hey, here are the types of here are the assessment that you just have to take or your kids have to take. But we are going to try to come in and say, there are a long list of very validated assessments that are out there. We strongly believe you should be choosing between one of those. And the third is what we call a commitment to a holistic vision for student success. And we actually believe that a holistic vision for student success is rooted in these three commitments that we've actually iterated at Teach for India. And those are that every child and every adult needs to be committed to self. So I'm growing myself, which basically means I'm learning how to read, write, develop the critical thinking skills, all of those to be successful. The second is the commitment to other. So I'm actually committed to being able to basically make change happen within my community. And the third is the commitment to India. So basically, because I'm committed to making change happen in my community, I'm committed to being able to build and grow a better country in the future. And so those three, the commitment to a holistic vision for student success, the commitment to basically self, and the commitment to other, the commitment to holistic vision for student success, the commitment to results, the commitment to equity, those define a large part of what we do. There are a couple of other principles that define the process, but those three really are the hallmark of what we do. Some of the others that we would kind of hold central are we want people to be committed to innovating and leveraging best practice. We think that entrepreneurs should be finding the balance between those. It shouldn't be all best practice, and it also shouldn't be all innovation. There is a balance between those two. We want entrepreneurs to be committed to trying to say, how do you redefine time and how do you redefine space? Can you think outside of the boundaries of the four walls? Can you think outside of the 4.5 hours? Can you redefine the who as well? Can we be more creative with the role that the teacher should play? But outside of those values-based principles, the rest we're actually leaving in the hands of the entrepreneur and trying to make sure the entrepreneur has choice and agency to be able to do what is right for the community that they are serving.
Right. Okay, so I'm gonna pause and I'll ask you a few questions here that make me curious. Having been a teacher for almost 16 years now, Sandeep, like my big problem with multiple other excellent educators was that all of these, even the holistic learning, the results, the commitment to equity, everything is so vague sometimes, and it's so easily shown but not done. A simple example, a really horrible but true example, is now Priyanka Chopra is across Ukraine working with kids at UNICEF and all of that. Is that her commitment to equity and commitment to results and commitment to a better world? Or is it good for her brand to be seen doing that? I don't know. And I think that's what makes our world broken, because people are just split up. Is she doing this just for the show? Is she doing this in reality? So sometimes when I worry about values, when we put kids into those too early, do they get suffocated by them and then they have to abide to them? Or are they truly doing it because they want to? And where, what's the, like in my kids, some of the meanest in my class, some of the meanest kids were fabulous because they called out uh you know rubbish for rubbish. They said this is great. They said things the way they wanted to, and they weren't the kindest and they weren't the nicest kids, but they were bright, and they really helped my class grow in unbelievable ways. My question is, how much how much with these principles, when these are the principles that our entrepreneurs are locked into, how much will the innovation really be able to erupt? And how much do you think there's a chance that we might kind of narrow down the innovation and the results because they're locked into these values of self and others and world and all of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm a big believer in like the need for a holistic vision for student success. Um, I think what we're learning from incubations across the world is a couple of things, right? One is, if you don't have a few principles that govern and that guide people, that you you just don't allow people, you're not able to create a learning network. You're not able to actually move together. And I think on the flip side, if you actually start to prescribe to say, actually, Devangana, you need to be using this phonics program, or here's how we think you should be teaching, you know, this level of reading, you start to basically highly constrain people, and you don't do what's right for kids within those environments. And I think if there's a spectrum of left to right, left being here's anything goes, right? It's like the wild, wild west. And on the right hand side, we're going to prescribe which phonics program you should be using and what you should be doing with seventh grade math. And here's the center. I think where we've positioned ourselves is quite left of center, to say, actually, we want to position ourselves more with autonomy. But what we've tried to step back and ask ourselves is what really are the key values that hold us together, what I'm convinced of is that an education that is for anything is probably not what we stand for. I think what I'm convinced of is that an education that is overly focused on self is not going to lead us to a better world. Now, do I think that that is going to prevent people from basically doing acts with bad intentions? No. But do I think we have a much better shot at being able to create a better world if we start young and start to help kids go down the path of committing to others at the same time? That to me feels very integral, And that to me feels rooted in what a lot of the research says around how do you teach kids empathy and how do you teach kids social awareness. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that, Sandeep. I feel like it's almost like if you're running a country, you need a constitution. If you're running a workplace, you need a set of rules, and there'll be people who follow them to the T, and there'll be people who break out a little. And I think that's where innovation, entrepreneurship, rule breaking, rule following, rule abiding all comes in. So I love these principles, and I think that those are good centering ways for anyone to grow out, and then they take their
Yeah.
journey. So
Yeah.
so Sandeep, in light of, how our world is shaping up digitally, I know, like, I kind of like feel like you and I, uh, like I sometimes struggle with, self self promotion, or like these are my values, or this is my dream, and all of that. But we've all become digital natives today. um, in view of how, racism is shaping up, how inequity is, globalization, nationalism, people questioning the core belief of racism, people questioning the core belief of what Yuval Noah Harari is saying, what Ezra Klein is saying. Like, people are just questioning everything that some of our big intellectuals are saying. Um, how how are some ways and directions you're thinking India and Indian educational entrepreneurs need to think in? Because we're living in a world which mostly agrees to disagree and disagrees to agree. And that's how thought leaders have always through history interacted with each other. How do you think these entrepreneurs in education, when they're creating innovative schools, what are some directions that they'll go in? Like, I just read an article by Ibrahim Kindi, it was in Boston Globe, about he's saying the scientific roots of racism are actually wonky in many ways. And there was a whole analysis of that. So we're just kind of going wild the more knowledge and information that we're collecting as a world. What do you think is going to be how these entrepreneurs are going to guide education?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that one is, are we basically equipping kids with the abilities to be able to think critically, right? And to think independently. And that's one. But I think if we just equip kids with critical thinking and we just equip kids with, like, here's how you think independently, like, here's how you should, like, be able to make substantive arguments and agree and disagree compellingly, like, I think we end up with the world that is only focused on I without focused on the we, right? And I think when you do that, you basically end up with like a lot of the breakdowns that we're seeing today, right? And that's where I think the role of equipping kids with like the commitment to other, with values, right? With like, how do I understand my neighbor? Like, how do I recognize that, like, my liberty depends on my neighbor being free too, right? Like, I think if we're able to equip kids with the awareness and the recognition that that is reality and that that basically is important, I think you start to equip kids with the abilities to basically not just think about like, am I agreeing like vehemently, or am I like, if I am I disagreeing, like, you know, just because like it's fun to do, versus like, am I actually figuring out what it means to be able to constructively build a better future? And so again, like, that's where I just think the role of values and basically the role of the other as well as the I becomes so incredibly important. And that's where I think like that principle of like, we believe in a holistic vision for student success that doesn't just span me, but also we, becomes really essential.
Well, I love that, Sandeep. So just to build off that, I think every human being, every child is made, it's nurtured in nature, right? So like a lot of our values are taught in schools, teachers embody them, teachers wear them, teachers teach them. But a lot of what we learn is at our homes. And and sometimes to like sometimes balancing the two becomes really hard, because I had kids who I taught all kinds of subjects to. I spent every possible minute planning lessons so that they learn morality and they learn Buddhism and they learn different religions and why different religions erupted. But then they went back home and the value system and what they saw was drastically different. So they were just like, why should we care about this when this is the reality of our lives? So like, how do you see, in light of the schools that we're working with, the kids that we're working with, the interplay of the backgrounds they come with, and all of that?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I guess like two things come to mind. One is like, how do we bring parents to the table in all of this, and how do we actually really see parents as like assets that could be like like really used well, right? Like I think I believe to my core that like every parent wants what's best for their children. They may not know how to equip them with it, but like I have yet to meet a parent who's like, I don't want what's best for my child. And so I think like that innate belief, how do we basically build on that and be able to lean heavily into it is one. And the second is like, I think this is where like extending the school day comes like really important, like how do we not just like figure out how to design around the 11% and then say the other 89% go off and do what you will, but actually think about how to make learning happen within that 89%. And I think that that becomes incredibly, incredibly important if we're actually going to figure out how to shift some of this, There are some estimates that say the vast majority of what kids need to know to be successful in their career actually comes from what they learn outside of school. Like, I just think we need to figure out how to influence and how to be able to actually get learning to happen within that space. Because if it just goes into this model where like you're at school, what you learn here happens, and then after that, like you don't think about any of that, and we're not thinking about how to design for that, I think it becomes incredibly tough.
Yeah. Okay. So Sandeep, tell me if like 5 years from today, what would be your ideal school that is erupted from Desierto, India? Like if you could close your eyes and think about the school you'd be the most proud of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tough one. I can tell you some of the schools that I've been the most inspired by, right? Which I think are starting to paint a little bit of like a vision, I think, of where like some of this could be building from, right? I'll give you three quick stories, right? And I'll give you a story in the US, I'll give you a story in Hong Kong, and I'll give you a story right here in India that's emerging. Like, I went to a school in the US in Missouri, right? Which is like middle of the US, right? It's like what most people would call like right in the heartland. And you walk into this school and the school actually looks like a WeWork space, right? Like, and when I say that, like they've actually designed the school around a WeWork setup. So it actually looks like you have conference rooms and you have group spaces. And when you actually look at what kids are doing, kids aren't like sitting in traditional classrooms, like they're learning in groups. They've got individual playlists, like they've got pods. Kids are actually spending time like working in nonprofits in the communities. Kids are like spending time meeting with life coaches every week, right? And all of their teachers have been trained to actually be coaches for kids. And when you talk to the founder of this school, you actually try to step back and you realize like his vision for this really is rooted in the belief that like when kids actually go into the workforce, like the vast majority of us, like we end up basically controlling majority of our calendars, majority of our schedules, right? And most of us are in control of our time, right, for the vast majority of the day. And that's where the workforce is headed. But when you look at what happens while kids are studying, pretty much until they get to college, even through college, like they are in this highly rigid environment, right, where it's like you're spending time like you've got everything decided for you. You basically have control over maybe 10% of your schedule. And so his big belief is like, what if we were to actually radically shift that? And starting from the sixth grade, like actually get kids to be fully in control. And so what that means is he's designed the school where kids are actually, they spend 70% of their time outside of a traditional classroom. They've got individual playlists. They are basically assessed weekly. And if they're making progress in that assessment, they continue on that path. If they basically get really off track, they spend slightly more time in a traditional space. But the vast majority of kids are actually spending time guiding their own learning. And so that's one really powerful example, I think, of what I've engaged with. And again, it's kids are committed to self, they're growing themselves. Kids are spending time in nonprofits serving, they're actually growing others. And through that, they're trying to figure out how to create a better world, but also give themselves greater opportunity. And I think there's immense power in that. Another is an example in Hong Kong that I actually learned about from 100, which is a Finnish-based organization that finds innovations across the world. And I've had the privilege of just being a judge for the past couple of years. But one of them is this school that kids actually spend majority of their day shadowing different professions. And so for 6 weeks out of the year, they'll be shadowing a fisherman. And the next 6 weeks, they will shadow a banker. And the next 6 weeks, they'll actually shadow an artist. And during that time, like they're actually learning about different professions. And then their afternoons, they come back together and they connect that to what have I learned about mathematics and how is that actually connecting to what we saw today? What am I learning about, like, the abilities to be able to write and how is that connected? And so they're learning about nonfiction text and fiction text. And they're learning about like, fisheries. And they're basically doing that. They're learning about the theory through what they're actually observing and shadowing and learning hands-on. And the third example is actually this emerging school that's actually coming up, a little bit outside of Jaipur, actually, where you're from. And they are actually trying to build a school that is not only socioeconomically diverse, where you have kids from nearby villages surrounding with kids from the city. And they've actually already started to be able to build this, but they're also trying to build a school where they really think about radical transformations and where power sits. And that means that they are doing everything with student voice at the center, right? Students are actually designing the actual architecture of the school with them. Students are actually deciding the curriculum of the school with them. Students are spending their time like really trying to build aspects of the school, and through that they're learning about math, through that they're learning about pieces around them. And so what you see as the common thread across all of these are like kids are engaged in things that are highly relevant. Kids are actually experiencing like a lot more agency than actually we've been used to for the past 150 years. Like kids are actually engaged with actually how do you make things better around them. But let me pause there.
Thank you. So Sandeep, my core belief is school systems are not made because of anybody else but the teachers. That's it. And my biggest, like for 10, 12 years, I've just been the rebellious child of school systems because I fought with all teachers because just how they practice inclusion, how they're teaching, what is the creativity they're bringing. I would see results and I'd see essays and I'd be like, I'd give this a 6 and 10. I don't know why you've given this a 10 and 10, right? So I'm that teacher. Like as a person, I'm feisty and I'm passionate, but as a teacher, I'm doubly feisty and doubly passionate, which means I hold very high standards and I work extremely hard. And I saw that multiple schools, and I've worked at some of the best schools. I just felt like most teachers don't bring that. How is the circle and the entrepreneurs going to really like make sure that their schools have teachers who embody the change making that is required and not just a school that holds these values? Because that's my big problem with schools. They say 12 things, but their teachers are doing 2 of those 12 things.
Yeah, such a great question. It's the third part of what we're trying to do. So I told you that one part is what we call incubation, and the second part is what we call labs, and the third part is really rooted in our belief that like you really can't reinvent schools unless teachers try to reinvent themselves. And at the heart of reinvented schools are teachers going down the process of reinvention themselves. And so what we're trying to basically launch, but we're staggering this out a few years down the line, is what we would call Circle U. And what Circle U is actually trying to inspiring to be is to say, like, can we create an institution that is a teacher university? And through that, like, can we actually use that as a platform for teachers to be able to reinvent themselves? And what would it mean to reinvent the very aspect of teacher education? Because it really does start and end with that. I believe that like we have lots of amazing teachers who do really well and who like have the right intentions, but I do think we need to go down a process of reinvention with like the actual practice of teaching. And unless you start and end with that, like I don't think you get very far. And so very much resonate with that.
Right. And Sandeep, my last question, which is really like close to me, and I ask all educators this. I feel like CEOs of company, teachers of classrooms, founders of companies, they're all kind of like similar. What do you think are the 2 or 3 values or foundations that anybody what a lot of CEOs and founders and directors are going to be listening to this conversation, but I think they're also teachers in some way. What do you think are the core values or beliefs that a teacher should hold? Because I think like the similarity is across leadership roles.
Core values and beliefs. Yeah, I mean, I think that like the ability to be able to really like believe that a better future is possible. I think like the commitment to believing that like what I said earlier, that my liberty depends on you being free too. So it's that I basically don't just see the me, but that I see the we. I think the belief that like that the me and the we is so rooted in this belief of equity, you know. I think that like the belief that like we need to be able to equip people with greater autonomy, but we also need to couple that with accountability, right? That like autonomy without accountability actually doesn't really take us very far, and accountability with autonomy doesn't take us very far as well. And that would be my advice for like for any teacher, but also for any business leader, you know. Yeah, I would say those.
I love that. Yeah. And I feel like when you put accountability before autonomy, your autonomy automatically gets narrowed down. We sometimes do it in the reverse. And I think that's where sometimes we go wrong. But just to keep holding accountability before anything else, I think can change our world.
And I would say stemming from that, the last one that I would say is just like what you said made me think about this, but I think the commitment to just basically hold people around us to high expectations, whether that's kids or adults. I think that people and kids like all have an innate desire to be successful, right? And like, I think the research is so compelling on like, people are successful when they actually hold them to their highest standard of themselves. Whether that's kids or adults, like that just holds true. And I think that like my advice or like my set of beliefs for any teacher or any like business leader would be like, how do we hold the people around us to the highest bar possible? Because we believe that they are capable of the highest things possible, because we believe that they are capable of changing the world. And I think when we do that, I think people rise to the best versions of themselves.
I fully, deeply agree. Thank you. Like this is just the best way to, I think, close it out. How do we hold each other to really, really high standards? Because I think feminism and growth and our economy, everything is going to just keep booming if we keep holding each other to high standards. So,
yeah.
Sandeep, this is excellent. I'm just really excited about the Circle India, what is possible in the field of educational entrepreneurship. I think we could see wonders and magic.
Really good to talk to you this morning, and what a great way to start my day.
Lovely. I hope you're taking the day off today, Cindy. Please take the day off.
Thank you. We don't have the day off, but thank you for that.
Take care.